Hi, and welcome back to another episode of Leadership Lenses, the podcast designed for principals, heads of school, and anyone else looking to enhance and improve Jewish education. We are really thrilled to have with us today a longtime colleague and someone who I've looked to for advice and guidance for years, if not decades, Rabbi Maccabee Avishur, currently the head of school at Kohelet Yeshiva. Rabbi Avishur has a long history in Jewish education, and what we're going to pick up on in this episode is a unique vantage point that he has because he spent many years as a national consultant working for the YU School Partnership, helping schools across the country, and now he's shifted to being in a school. And those two perspectives, I think, are going to come together to give us some fascinating insights that we can't wait to learn from. So, Maccabee, thank you very much for joining us today. So happy to have you here.
My pleasure to be here. Thanks, Barry. Thanks for inviting me.
So just give us the quick 10 seconds. Tell us a little bit about what you did at the YU School Partnership and then how you found yourself ultimately sitting in a head of school chair at this moment.
I started my career in the classroom and in schools in junior and middle leadership positions. And then when I went to YU, I focused on leadership development, leadership placement, pre-career teacher training, governance training, curriculum development, pretty much the gamut of things that schools do. And then I ended up back in schools about 8 years ago in some senior leadership positions. And now I'm sitting as the head of school at Kohelet Yeshiva in Lower Merion in near Philadelphia.
Amazing. So you have this really wide understanding and recognition. And, one of the hazards of being a coach and consultant that I know I encounter is you tend to give a lot of advice. And now you got the chance to see oh, what does it feel like to be on the other end of that? And was I right in my advice? Was I wrong? So tell me a little bit about something that perhaps surprised you or was unexpected when you shifted from that broad perspective to the internal perspective. How did you see things? And then how does that change once you're in the role?
Colleague of ours once told me when I was working at YU, Maccabee, you use the word should a lot. Like, you guys should be doing this or should be doing that. And he said, would you consider using the word could instead of should? And I was like, well, but you really should. Now that I'm in the head of schools chair, I realize he was right, because there's not stuff that we all should be doing, because things are generally not binary. It's not I should do X or Y. There's always a third way. And that's an approach that took me a while to learn. And I think sitting in schools really helped me appreciate that perspective more.
Okay, amazing. So let's unpack that a little bit, right? And I'll say one of the first things that you did as a consultant working with my school back in Cleveland was about new teacher onboarding, training, all of those pieces. So maybe let's pick up something there. What did you think was the right way? And how did that become more complex when you were actually trying to apply the knowledge?
That's a great question. With new teacher training, it's actually maybe I would say a little bit less complex because most new teachers do need a lot of the same supports. But I would say maybe the approach was a little bit too generic back in the day. If I would come into a school who was trying to onboard new teachers, we would suggest a very similar approach for every new teacher, whether they were Jewish studies or general studies, whether they had some natural talent or whether they were less naturally talented, if that's a thing. And now I think we would be more nuanced in that approach, because every teacher is also an individual. And I would recognize that each teacher really needs a more, oh my gosh, the words escape me. I apologize.
Personalized, customized.
Personalized approach. Thank you.
Amazing. I definitely hear that. And I think it, makes sense. We actually had a saying. I said this less than one of my colleagues who was much taller than I am, which was, right, when you're coaching basketball, there's a lot you can teach, but you can't teach height. So
Right.
I'm curious, as we got into this, and you, I'm sure, in a position of hiring or supervising people or hiring new teachers, and you've had all this experience in onboarding, what are the things that you can teach and what are the things that you cannot teach and you need to make sure the person has when they're walking in the door?
That's a really important question because this is also back at YU, our team strongly believed that heads of school were hiring primarily for charisma. And we actually had some data to back that up. And we felt that that was a mistake the field was making because they were overlooking candidates who might have been less charismatic, but also could be really successful in the classroom. I still hold by that today. But charisma is important, I should say. That's kind of like whereas I might have spoken more strongly against charisma as an important factor, today I support that some form of charisma, again, whatever that means, is important for teachers to succeed with children. So I want people to think about that and how they measure for it and how they check themselves against hiring only for charisma.
Right, right. It's really easy to hire the inspirational person. We all have our biases. Many people are biased towards that inspirational person. Some people, I think, based on some of the unfortunate pieces that we've seen over the years, are nervous about
Of
someone
course.
with charisma and what feels like too much charisma.
Yeah.
But when you say there's a certain charisma they need to have, what does that look like? How would you guide a principal or head who is trying to hire now? Like, okay, I just heard that they should have charisma. What does that mean?
So it's, there are many different kinds of charisma, as I alluded to earlier. When we, the school leaders, talk about that, we mean a few different things. Number one, when the person's standing in front of the room, we want to understand that person has some confidence, that the person's making eye contact, that the person has a pleasant demeanor. It doesn't have to always be smiling because that can seem awkward sometimes, but they have to have a pleasant demeanor. We use this word, they have to be engaging. The students have to be engaged. So I always ask, what do you mean by engagement? What are the students doing and what is the teacher doing? And again, that looks a variety of different ways. The teacher is seeking out student input and the students are responding, not because it's awkwardly silent in the room when the teacher is asking for answers, but because something about what the teacher is saying is exciting to them intellectually, spiritually, affectively. That's, I think, what charisma means for us.
So what we're talking about really is a lot of those interpersonal skills, right? You
Yes.
have to know how to connect. You have to know how to communicate. And you might be a soft-spoken person. You might be a little bit of a louder personality,
Yeah.
but those are some base level skills that I think everybody is definitely looking for.
Exactly.
When you think about it, I want to go on to some other issues, but just to finish the picture here, are there any other must-haves that somebody needs to have walking into the room that you really cannot teach or train for when you're looking to hire?
The person has to be reflective and what I would call coachable. It is very hard to teach someone to be coachable or to be honestly reflective. And that is something that we've actually built a hiring process that allows us to test for this. What we do is the teacher will give the same model lesson twice to two different groups of students, not two different model lessons, which is what many schools do. But it's literally the same lesson. After they teach the first lesson, they sit down with the supervisor, the principal or whoever it's going to be, and they review the lesson much like we would do in a clinical supervision cycle. What did you like about the lesson? What could you do differently? What went as you planned, etc. And they discuss what the teacher would do differently the next time they taught it. Then they have a break to work on their lesson, to take care of their business, whatever, and they reteach the lesson after having received that feedback so that we can then see what changes did this teacher make. Were they nimble? Were they able to adjust and to take the coaching that they just received and improve the teaching product?
Nice, nice. I love that. I also love the fact that if you're not coachable or you're not reflective, that's a catch-22, which makes it exceedingly difficult to help you become reflective or coachable
It's a good
because you're
point.
not listening, right?
Exactly.
That is the most challenging piece. But what I hear here is actually a fascinating merge because I hear you saying some of the things that I know I heard from you way back when you were working broadly, saying we need systems for teacher hiring. It shouldn't just be walking in, who makes the best impression, who's the buddy of the principal or the head of school, and that person gets hired. We need to know what our portrait of an excellent teacher is.
Yes.
And we need to build processes that allow us to unearth that so that we do hiring well. Hiring is one of the most challenging things that we do as heads. And I love the way that you've given just one example of how you make visible and you really test for a key characteristic. So it's noting what you need and then building process to do that. And that to me is all, what I learned from Maccabee when he was coaching schools across the field. But you also seem to have added a little bit of nuance here to, hey, what do we need in our school? And how do we allow the picture to be complex and not one size fits all?
Yeah, you're talking about something that I think is really important. You called it the portrait of an excellent teacher. And I want to give credit to the Mandel Center at Brandeis University that really taught me this. We have to have in our schools a vision, a shared vision of good teaching. What does that look like in our school? Because I don't call it like the ideal teacher, because our teachers are all so different, but we should all kind of be dancing around the same vision of good teaching and celebrating that together, because each teacher will approach that vision slightly differently because we teach who we are. And I think schools should spend some time developing what that looks like. Oftentimes, schools will default towards using a framework like a Danielson or a Marshall, and those are great places to begin. But we have to also add what's unique about our schools to those frameworks.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And unpacking that and figuring out what it actually looks like and what are we looking for in the hiring process and then in the classroom is
Right.
excellent. And I also love that, as a head of school, and we'll get to the other side of the head responsibilities in a second, but you're obviously clearly still very involved on that educational side and shaping the vision of teaching and learning in the school, which I know for most of us as heads and principals is why we got into it. And sometimes
Yeah.
we find ourselves without enough time to really be meaningfully involved there.
Yeah. I'm fortunate because I'm in a school that is the right size for me to be able to do that.
Got it. Got it. And I imagine you also have a team and other people in place that complete that. But let
Exactly.
me shift to the kind of broader pieces, the governance, the organizational leadership, because those were all pieces that you were also involved with from a broad perspective and probably had a lot of shoulds. And I do believe that there are many best practices in governance. There are a lot of them that I teach and that I work with schools on. And at the same time, there's a lot of nuance from school to school. So can you give us some insight as to some of the things that you thought were across the board, everyone needs to do this, and then you walked in and said, maybe it's a little bit more complex once we're actually sitting with and getting in deep with the board?
Yeah. So this is the area governance where that could versus should nuance plays out most in my experience sitting in the head of school position versus what I would have said as a consultant. And one example of this, one specific example, is in terms of term limits. I would always, the best practices, and NIS recommends, and the board source says, term limits, especially for your board president. But what I have seen in the Jewish day school field is that is usually true, but not always. As a head of school, if we have, let's say, 2-year terms and maximum of 2 terms, that means I'm getting a new boss every 4 years and sometimes every 2 years. That can make my head spin. It takes a lot of time to build trust between me and my board president, my boss. And sometimes it might be helpful to ignore best practice and follow what is actually good for your school. So that's just one specific example.
Got it. Interesting. Okay. So that's fascinating. And I will say that I am, in general, also a fan of term limits, whether it's 2 years or 3 years or 4 years, however we define it, we have to find that sweet spot. And at the same time, we know that in some of the research on board governance in Jewish day schools, I think Alex Thompson termed it as getting selected as a board president means you were the slowest person to say not it. So
Exactly.
it's not always easy to find a replacement. And at the same time, we don't want people who are serving in the position for 15 or 20 years as often happened in the past. So we have to figure out
Yeah.
how we balance that.
I want to clarify. I am in favor of term limits, but I also want to say that you could have term limits. That was my point. Is that
Got it.
sometimes it doesn't work for a school. Sometimes because your second term is up does not mean I have to kick you out of the presidency if that's not what's best for your school at this time.
Right. That actually reminds me of a phrase that I heard often from a mentor, which applies to all these best practices, which is you need to know where the lines are.
Yeah.
And then sometimes you need to color outside them.
Yes,
But you need to do that knowing where the lines are, knowing you're coloring outside for a reason and doing it carefully and thoughtfully and balancing those two aspects.
that's right. And making sure that coloring outside the lines does not become the default.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And don't look at any of my kindergarten drawings because they are a terrible example of that.
Right.
Or my current drawings would also probably be a terrible example. But Tell me more about the governance side, because again, you went from teaching best practice to now a place where you're sitting and building partnerships with board members, with board presidents. What do you see now living in those partnerships that maybe you didn't see more broadly? And how do you put those two together?
That's a really tough question to answer. When I was working with schools across North America, specifically with governance, the complaints from the school professionals were all the same. Our board members who are serving in lay leadership positions are some of the most well-meaning, well-intentioned people who only want what's best for the school. And we are so grateful to them for everything they do, both with their time and their treasure. And sometimes boards can be either low functioning or dysfunctional. And that's actually fairly common in the Jewish day school field, at least from the professional's point of view. And when you do these assessments with boards, it turns out to be kind of true. The boards are not as high performing as they might think they are from their self-reporting. And so having sat on the outside, I would say this is now confirmed for me on the inside as well. Like, boards have a very difficult time finding the right people, as Alex pointed out, to serve in these capacities and to actually deliver the service that schools need from their lay leaders. And again, it's not because they don't mean well. It's an incredibly challenging job to be a lay leader in a school.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so we have people around the country still who are doing various kind of training, board trainings, board retreats, all of these various pieces. I'm very curious as to how you respond to that and what you choose to engage with, because you've seen those trainings, you've run those trainings, and now you're sitting in a school. So with all of that knowledge, what do you think is the most useful and helpful pieces that can be brought to the school?
Number one, board self-assessment is really important. In fact, when I signed my contract, I included as a clause that the board was going to go through some training, which we're still working on getting to happen because the board wasn't used to this. And so the first step we took was doing a board self-assessment, which we're finalizing now. And I think that was really helpful. But it has to be the right kind of assessment. And we spent a lot of time trying to figure out what kind of assessment would reveal to the board information about itself that would actually be helpful. So I think that's something that all boards should be doing. It's really important. Again, that idea of being reflective and being coachable applies to boards as well. So that's for me, number one. Then the data that emerges from that will determine for each school what they need to work on. I don't want to speak about my board because that's only relevant to me here in Philadelphia and not to the field. But I think that the head board chair partnership is a critical feature. There has to be a lot of trust there. Head of school support and evaluation is an area that certainly needs focus. And there are other areas as well. What do you see out there?
Yes. So I appreciate the, turning that back on me. So I would say number one, head chair partnership is most crucial. That is the single most influential relationship across the entire school system. And I see heads who have excellent partnerships with a board chair, and I see heads who have excellent partnerships with chair after chair after chair when they've been in a school for years or decades. And what I see as the core feature of those partnerships is the willingness to learn together. So in some format, whether you're rereading the school's bylaws and looking at them together, which is a lot of fun, or you're reading the NAS trustee handbook, or doing something else that allows you to learn together, it goes back to what you were saying about being coachable. That is a huge piece of the partnership. There's also the piece, as you said, of the head of school support and evaluation committee, which I find many schools find really tricky to navigate because it is a tricky relationship. Jane Talbot Cohen, who I know has been a mentor for both of us, says that a head of school is both the employee of and teacher of the board.
Exactly.
And it is really difficult to be in both those seats. And that's where I actually find some of the external assessments or bringing in some sort of external voice can be helpful, because as the head sitting there in their chair, if there's something that needs to be changed, it's often really difficult for the head to be the first one to say that. And
Yes.
if you've got a great board assessment that is either run internally or you brought somebody externally to run that kind of assessment who can say, hey guys, we might need to take another look at the way we have our head support and evaluation committee set up, the way we do board nominations, the way we have our committee structured, or broadly speaking, the way that the executive committee and the president are partnering with the head, that can open a door to a conversation, which I see as being really helpful and really productive.
Yeah, it's speaking of that, just flipping back to the board and chair, the board chair and head of school partnership. A shout out to my board president, Lori Salkin, who says to me, and this is kind of I think the learning for any board presidents listening to this. She says to me pretty frequently, my job is to support you and to make sure you feel and you make sure you are successful. It's so I don't need to hear that because I'm not a needy person, but it's so good to hear because I believe her when she says that. So board presidents, that is one of your primary roles. Of course, you're there as a fiduciary for the school, but you can do that by supporting and ensuring the head's success.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm going to give you the flip side of some of that, which I learned to do as a head. One of my earlier chairs, I learned a tremendous amount from about leadership. And one of the simplest things they did at the end of a meeting, we typically met at like 6:30 to 7:15 a.m. on a Monday morning because that was the only time that worked in their schedule. And, I had nothing better to do. So we would have our meeting. We would go through the agenda. It might be 5 or 10 minutes before the end of our allotted time. And they would more often than not lean across the table and just say, Barry, how are you doing? Which to me was like, it's simple words. You might have said at the beginning, hey, how are you doing? But just changing tone and turning to the other person in this dyad partnership and saying, I care about how you are doing, I found tremendously meaningful. And it's something that I actually encourage heads to say to their chairs. Because as a head, we often feel like, well, the chair is my supervisor. They don't need my approval. They don't. And as you said before, Maccabee, heads are coming into this without any professional training. This is a volunteer job. And being able to show that kind of care and concern on a personal level from the seat of the head can also fundamentally shift and really shape that relationship in a different way.
So true. Board chairs are people too. And again, they're volunteers and they get a lot of garbage from people out. So it's not an easy job. So thank you to all the board chairs for doing what you're doing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And let's touch last point here because we mentioned the idea of your leadership team. I know you have a number of educational administrators that work within your team. What did you learn about that sort of teamwork and leadership? Because I know, again, that was an area you dealt with broadly, and now you're implementing it in your own school. What did you learn there?
That was something we would like to work with schools on back in the day was distributed leadership, which some schools were much more effective at than others. And in some schools, it wasn't the right model for whatever reason. Their cultural context, their parent body, the teachers, it needed to be more top down and less distributive. But schools that have a distributive model tend to see a lot of success. And I'm really appreciative that my school already had such a model when I came into it, and I'm able to lean into that, and we support each other in really effective ways. I know that I can empower the members of my team to make decisions and keep me informed. They know when to consult me about decisions. And one thing we've been working on is trying to understand, because this can be a complicated piece, who's actually in charge of what. When leadership is distributed across a bunch of different people, sometimes things can fall through the cracks because it's not clear who's the accountable person. So we've been working since I arrived on ensuring that we always ask the question, who's the A, who's accountable, who's responsible for doing what, who needs to be consulted, and who should be informed.
Amazing. So I love that you just listed out all the elements of our RACI chart for those org psych geeks here, right? Responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And I also love that you're touching on some of the nuts and bolts here, because one crucial aspect of team leadership and distributive leadership is the relationships, the bonding, the inspiration, the trust, all of those pieces. And those are 1000% important. And at the same time, you have to also have all of those clear lines and clear understandings, because otherwise, whatever trust you've built can go away. So for those listening who might not be familiar with the terms, I need to know, if I'm working on Maccabee's team, what he needs to be informed about, which means I do it and then I tell him about it, but I'm doing it. what he wants to be consulted about, which means we talk first before I do something. And even that basic distinction, when you put it into words for people, can clarify so many misunderstandings and develop your own internal team habits of, let's apply this and let's make sure to get this right. And to me, that kind of brings us full circle to what you were saying in the beginning. And I would say maybe a meta point about leadership, which is we have these systems, right? We have a system for onboarding teachers, for hiring teachers. We have systems for governance practice. We have systems for team management. And our success as leaders is fundamentally about taking those systems, not letting go of them, but balancing them with our insight, our nuance, our complexity, and the real people who are living in these systems in each one of our institutions. It just sounds like you've made that transition and brought those two pieces together. And that's really the key insight that I'm taking out of all the aspects of our conversation here.
I love that insight. And it's, I think the gift of the years I've been in this field is the gift of flexibility. I have learned that you need to be more flexible in your thinking than I once was. I was much more rigid as a younger leader and as a consultant than I am today. And I'm really appreciative that Hashem has given me the ability to learn to be more flexible.
Absolutely. That is a tremendous point as we're all growing in our leadership. And it goes with the coachability and the reflection. We want to be leaders who learn. And if we are leaders who learn, we're going to become more flexible, more reflective, and more coachable as we go, rather than getting stuck in our ways, which I know is something that none of us want to do. So I know that, this has been really fascinating and insightful for me, and I really appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time to be with us, Maccabee. If our listeners want to reach out to you with any follow-up questions, is there a place that they can reach you?
Yeah, I love to talk shop with people in the field, so please reach out. You can find my contact information, including my email and my cell phone number, on the school's website, koheletyeshiva.com.
Amazing. We'll put that in the show notes as well. And hope that you all sitting there have heard some of these pieces. And I encourage you, as we always do, to take one of them and try it out. Figure out one way that you may be able to merge a system and an approach with that flexibility. So if you tend towards the flexibility and creative side, maybe think about where you might want to integrate more of a system. And if you tend more to the system side, think about where you might want to integrate some creativity. Try it out and let us know how it goes. And you can reach me, as always, Barry Kislowitz, on LinkedIn, Leadership Lenses on Substack, or at our website, kislowitzconsulting.com.